Russia lost its global power potential with its decision to invade Ukraine. First, the Russian army found itself in a 3-year war of attrition. Then the Moscow regime was forced to watch NATO grow in the Baltics and Scandinavia. Finally, Russia's access to Africa was restricted through Syria. It was quite remarkable that Russia faced one setback after another, but for Putin, the nightmare was just beginning. Now it was Russia's turn to face difficulties in the Far East maritime areas. The UK and Japan, backed by the US, are preparing to corner Russia in the Pacific, a country that was considered a naval superpower before the Ukraine war began. This joint effort, seen as a New Year's plan, was intended to make the region less risky by preventing the expansion of Russian naval assets into the Pacific. So what will the UK and Japan do in the Pacific? In 2025, backed by the US in a guarantor role, will Russian President Vladimir Putin take any retaliatory steps against this military alliance that blends the West and the Far East? How long will the water temperature in the Pacific remain hot after these critical situations between the parties? We'll explore the answers to all these questions and much more, but first, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and give us a like to stay up to date with our content. The UK and Japan will hold regular military EXC exercises in the Indo-Pacific from 2025 to enhance security and further develop the ability of each country's armed forces to act together. These exercises will also involve the United States. The aim is to make Russia's Far Eastern maritime areas more secure. The exercises are therefore expected to extend to the North Pacific Ocean. For the UK and Japan, military exercises in this region are of great importance. The UK is already conducting several exercises in the region where HMS Bay and HMS Tamar are permanently deployed. Next year, the Royal Navy aircraft carrier HMS Prince of Wales will deploy to the region at the head of an aircraft carrier strike group, which will conduct a series of operations and exercises with partners and allies, including a port visit in Japan. With such operations, HMS Prince of Wales follows the successful deployment of its sister ship HMS Queen Elizabeth to the region in 2021. Of course, it is also important for Japan that there is no Russian threat in the Pacific. The fact that Japan is Russia's neighbor is often overlooked, especially in the West. In fact, Japan has not had a land border with Russia for 79 years. However, Japan has always confronted Russia along the Sea of Japan and the Sea of Okhotsk, and was at the forefront of the Cold War in Asia until 35 years ago now, as the geopolitical conflict between Russia and the West reemerges. Japan is once again at the forefront, as during the Cold War the focus is on the sea. Most of the ground forces in the Russian Far East are thought to have been redeployed to the battlefields in Ukraine, and many garrisons have been evacuated. In contrast, the submarine force of the Russian Pacific Fleet is being steadily built up, with particular emphasis on the modernization of nuclear ballistic missile submarines. The Japanese side has therefore decided to conduct joint military exercises in the Pacific with the United Kingdom in 2025. The problem for Japan was not only Russia's increasing number of submarine satellite imagery showed that Russia's nuclear ballistic missile submarine fleet had become significantly more active in recent years. The risk was seen as that increased Russian submarine activity north of Japan could strain the deterrent resources of the US-Japanese alliance in the face of the Chinese threat. This would require a joint Western response. The US and Japan, together with their Indo-Pacific partners, have sought to balance Chinese military power. Now, with Russia's renewed activity, the strategy is expanding northward. In the process of this expansion, Japan is bringing the United Kingdom on board so as not to be alone against Russia. Russia's job is very difficult in the face of this alliance. The aim of the alliance is to remind Russia of the old history. Almost a century ago, one of the greatest naval battles in history took place in the Tsushima Strait, where the Japanese Navy defeated the Russian Baltic Fleet. However, the role the Tsushima Strait played during the Cold War is not well known. Tsushima was the strait for the Soviet fleet sailing from Vladivostok to the Pacific and Indian Oceans, just as Russian Admiral Zheny had to pass through Tsushima during the Russo-Japanese War. Soviet submarine captains had to do the same. Nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines were no exception. Submarines from the Soviet Northern Fleet made various efforts to avoid underwater hydrophone systems, as witnessed by American and Soviet submariners. The same thing was happening in the waters around Japan. Soviet submarines would often cut their engines very close to the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force observation posts in the Tsushima Strait, and then quietly sail away to the East China Sea on the current. Soviet corvettes were always anchored in the strait, and when nuclear submarines passed by, they would start their engines to intercept Japan's underwater hydrophones. On the other hand, it was possible to reach the Pacific Ocean from Kamchatka, unhindered by the narrow passages. Thus, the submarine units of the Pacific Fleet gradually made this peninsula their home base, and almost every month a Yankee-class submarine would move from here to the patrol area known as the Yankee Box, located between 2,000 and 2,500 km from the west coast of the United States in the mid-1970s. Delta I and Delta III class submarines appeared in the Pacific Fleet equipped with long-range R-29 and R-29R ballistic missiles. The Delta S no longer needed to sneak across the Pacific to waters off the U.S. mainland. Instead, the strategy was to retreat to waters near the Soviet Union, where it would be easier to get support from friendly forces. The Delta S also had another advantage. While the Yankees had to travel at a high speed of 15 knots when heading towards the coast, the Delta S could travel at a lower speed of 448 knots. This contributed to greatly increasing their probability of survival. Western analysts referred to the emerging Soviet strategy as submarine fortresses. The most famous stronghold was the Barents Sea for the Northern Fleet's nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines. On the other hand, the Pacific Fleet's stronghold was the Sea of Okhotsk shortly after the first. Delta I was deployed in 1974. The Soviet Union began to fortify the area around the Sea of Okhotsk. The first step was the deployment of ground forces. The 18th Machine Gun Artillery Division was created and sent to the southern Coral Islands for the first time in 20 years. These islands in Sakhalin Island were equipped with Surfik 2 ship missiles and air defense systems. In addition to these developments, a huge caldera on Seymour Island was converted into a submarine base. Such stories are relatively unknown in the West amid a huge focus on submarine warfare in the North Atlantic, but the effects of history are still the same today. Russia had also learned its lesson from history after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Pacific Fleet's nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarine units found themselves in a difficult situation due to a drastic reduction in the defense budget and hyperinflation. The Russian military could not sustain itself and officers, and so soldiers did not have enough food. Even for their daily meals, the nuclear reactors of the submarines were not used for nuclear deterrence patrols, but to supply electricity to homes. From the late 1980s to the 1990s, the number of submarine patrols of the Russian Navy continued to decline, reaching almost zero in the early 2000s. The fact that large sums of money were being wasted on maintaining immobilized submarines was not good news for the Russian military. In the 1990s, Andrei Kushin, Secretary of the Defense Committee, planned to concentrate the Northern Fleet's nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines by closing the submarine base in Kamchatka. When President Vladimir Putin came to power in 2000, the chief of the General Staff, General Anatoly Kashinin, is said to have advised him to close the Kamchatka submarine base. However, Putin rejected this proposal. Had the two class submarines not been deployed in 20156, the Kamchatka Peninsula base might have been abandoned. After all, whatever Putin may have said, the Pacific Fleet's nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarine force was weak and dilapidated. By the early 2010s, only 3 older Delta III submarines remained, and their activity was very slow. While all the Delta Fez in the Northern Fleet had been modernized, the Delta III class submarines in the Pacific Fleet had not been given the same opportunity this could have been, because the Sevmash shipyard, where they were built, was located far from Kamchatka and therefore difficult to maintain in the end. Experts believe that the day was not far off when nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines would disappear from the Russian Pacific Fleet, and when that happened, the fleet would become a coastal fleet of small surface ships and conventionally powered submarines before Admiral Sergei Gorkov began to realize his dream of a transoceanic Navy. It would be a return to the Pacific Fleet of the Stalin era. However, with the introduction of the Borik class, the Pacific Fleet was able to continue to play a strategic role. In addition, 3 upgraded Boreas submarines began arriving in the fleet after 2022, and all older Delta III submarines were decommissioned. The Pacific Fleet's nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarine force was greatly expanded in both size and quality and became almost comparable to the Northern Fleet. From 2021 to 2022, Russian nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines made only 1 or 2 voyages a year, lasting more than a month, and several relatively short voyages lasting 1 to 3 weeks. AHA never had a confirmed deployment lasting more than a month. In 2023, the 2 Boreas sent to Kamchatka in 2020 or to 23 appear to have been treated as rookies for some time after their deployment, but between January and September 2024, there were 3 confirmed patrols lasting more than a month, and 2 of them lasted more than 2 months. More interestingly, these long patrols were all carried out by Boreas. The rookies were surprisingly starting to make their mark. In 2024, Emperor Alexander III was commissioned as the 3rd Boreas. It is believed that 1 or 2 more will be commissioned. It was also thought that the special mission in nuclear submarine Belgorod, equipped with the Poseidon nuclear-powered unmanned underwater system, would be deployed to Amatka under the command of the Ministry of Defense's main directorate for deep-sea research. It is quite possible that the submarine would be tasked with investigating and even destroying critical underwater infrastructure, such as submarine cables. Threats to the activities of The main directorate for deep-sea research had been noted in Europe since the 2010s, but the lack of major bases on the Pacific side meant that the sense of crisis on the Japanese side was low. The general situation will change in the near future, probably in the short term, because the absence of large bases is a worrying situation for Japan's security community. The source of the concern goes back a long way. In the 1980s, Japan's ground self-defense forces adopted a strategy called Northern Forward Defense, since the Sea of Okhotsk was the patrol area for the Soviet Union's ballistic missile fleet, Hokkaido, which extends far out too. Sea would certainly be a prime target for attack. The Northern Forward Defense strategy was to reinforce the island with strong ground forces, including Japan's only armored division, and deploy long-range surfact-to-ship missiles. At the same time, the Japan Ground Self-Defense Force strengthened its anti-submarine warfare capabilities as the number and capabilities of Soviet submarines operating in the waters around Japan increased significantly. An anti-submarine warfare task force was formed around destroyers equipped with anti-submarine helicopters, and it was also decided to deploy 100 P-3C patrol aircraft. These were noisy PL with distinctive tails flying around my hometown. After enjoying the peace dividend for nearly 15 years, the Japanese security community turned its attention to the southwest as China's naval and air forces began to rapidly strengthen. The Japan Ground Self-Defense Forces adopted a policy of shifting southwest, and Hokkaido came to be seen as a strategic reserve base rather than a front line. This was seen as the background to, and the reason why the increased Russian submarine activity was so alarming if the number of deployed bore submarines continues to increase, and assuming that each submarine patrols for an average of 2 months, it is estimated that a nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarine will always be deployed in the Sea of Okhotsk, but the limited resources of Japan's ground self-defense forces in the U.S. Pacific Fleet are already forced to operate on a tight rotation. In fact, the overall situation is further complicated by the fact that Russia has allowed China to enter the region. 15 years ago, Russia would never have allowed the Chinese fleet to operate in the Sea of Okhotsk or the Arctic. In fact, when the Chinese fleet passed through the Sea of Okhotsk without permission in 2011, Russia expressed its displeasure by holding missile firing exercises, but things have changed dramatically in the last decade. Isolated from the West, Russia has deepened its ties with China, including militarily. China's People's Liberation Army has joined Russia's strategic level exercises, and both countries' bombers and fleets have begun conducting joint patrols. In addition, the Chinese and Russian fleets conducted joint exercises in the Sea of Okhotsk for the first time in 2023. Russia finally officially recognized the presence of the Chinese Navy in the Sea of Okhotsk in 2024. Chinese and Russian bombers conducted patrol flights in the Arctic Chukchi Sea, and the two counts fleets again conducted exercises in the Sea of Okhotsk. So looking at all this from a much broader perspective, Russian submarines are becoming more active in Japan's northern waters, and there is a threat to critical underwater infrastructure in peacetime. Also, China and Russia are increasing their military cooperation in Japan's northern waters. The Japan-US alliance has limited resources and may not be able to respond to all threats from China, North Korea, and Russia. So what could be the solution during the Kishida administration? Japan's decision to increase defense spending to 2% of GDP, ease some of the resource constraints. Kishida's successor, Prime Minister Shigeru Yasuda, is continuing on the same path. Jet-propelled P-1s have replaced the P-3Cs flying over Matsudo, and they are even noisier. But this is not enough. Deterring several military powers in Eurasia at the same time is a very difficult task. There are limits to what the Japan-US alliance can do alone. And this is where the UK's role comes in. In 2025, the United Kingdom plans to stand behind Japan more intensively. This will send a lot of intimidation messages to Russia. The challenge for the future will be to expand, strengthen, and connect the security cooperation networks that already exist. The idea of Japan and South Korea joining the Australia-AUKUS framework has been discussed for some time. With new exercises in 2025, these discussions may become even more focused. The cooperation underlying these discussions is aimed at maintaining the balance of power in the North Pacific. It is also possible that Japan and South Korea could share activities in the Tsushima Strait and the East China Sea using the surveillance and warning capabilities of the South Korean Navy and Air Force. But a Western partnership would give the Tokyo government a much easier breathing space via Moscow. In short, the naval game between Russia and the West is getting tougher every year. But there is no limit to the number of players in this game. This could work to the advantage of Western allies.